Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on Rethinking Learning Systems with the TinCan API. My name is Mike Rustici. I'm going to be talking to you guys for the next hour or so about how the world is now reconceiving the notion of architectures, ways we can start to be thinking about our learning systems now that the TinCan API is enabling us to do a whole bunch of new things and creating some kind of non-obvious changes the way we kind of the learning system from a very high level. It's amazing how often a little technological advance, even technological, but something that is meant to be an incremental tech causes us to rethink how the whole industry can operate. I think if you're looking for an analogy, you can start to look at, maybe MP3 format for digitizing. At first was a new way of moving around, kind of conceptually do well. But as the industry started to adopt that and to conceptualize what it means to be a music industry, it had some severe disruptive effect on the whole learning industry. And I think you're looking at something really similar with the TinCan API right now. That an incremental advance in the technology is positioning a lot of potential changes within the whole industry. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. And I'm seeing some notion that the audio is really poor. Hopefully this is getting a little bit better. I'll be trying to hold my microphone a little bit closer to my mouth over here. So hopefully this got better in the last 30 seconds or so. Anyway, a couple quick bits of logistic information. The first is this event should be being live tweeted. We've got Megan out there in the Twitter universe putting things out there if you want to follow along or contribute to the discussion. The hashtag is #TinCanAPI. And feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the question box in the webinar panel over there. We're going to try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. And anything we don't get to during the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with afterwards and get webinars out there. So getting started, I want to start with a quick kind of poll question to judge you're familiar with TinCan and kind of set some expectations for how I should be talking about this stuff. So take a few minutes. How familiar are you guys with TinCan as a whole? And we'll give about 20, 30 seconds to let you guys make your selections. Are you a fanboy or girl? Moderately familiar, done some reading, heard the name, not much more, or are you just utterly in the wrong place today? Okay, that's been 30 seconds. It looks like, about 60% of you in the I've done some reading category. We got 20% as fanboys or girls and 20% who've heard the name or not all that much more. So we're going to start today with kind of a high-level overview of TinCan, just to refresh your memory a little bit. And for those of you who are the biggest fanboys and girls, you can kind of fall asleep for the next 2 minutes. For those of you who have done some reading, this is probably going to be a lot of review. For those of you who have heard the name but not much more, we're going to give you a really, really quick overview of what TinCan can do, what its core capabilities are. But it's not this session is not going to be a deep dive into exactly what TinCan is. This is more about the implications of TinCan. And if you want to kind of get a deep dive into what TinCan is, we've got some prior recorded webinars that you can find at tincanapi.com/presentations, I believe it is, that will give you a really deep dive into those and a lot of other great materials out there. So real quick now, just a couple minutes, what is TinCan and where are we? At its highest level, I'm going to assume most people on this webinar are familiar with the e-learning industry and know what SCORM is, the de facto industry standard we've had for the last decade. And at its highest level, TinCan is the replacement for SCORM. It's the new e-learning standard that allows for e-learning systems to exchange data and track what is happening, what people are learning, what types of learning activities they are doing. Right now, it's very much an emerging specification that has very, very rapid adoption so far. To give you a little context, TinCan's been in development now for about 3 years. It takes a while to get these things done, but it just now hit a 1.0 version about 6 weeks ago. So it's still very much in its infancy, still brand new. We're still figuring out how the world is going to do things with it. But it's amazing how quickly it's starting to be adopted. A quick antidote for you, there's a conference called Learning Solutions, and that happened in March this year. Well, last year at Learning Solutions in March, we went around to all the exhibitors in that hall and said, hey, there's this new thing coming, Tin Can, you might want to start paying attention to it, trying to get the vendors interested in it. Well, this year at Learning Solutions, before Tin Can even hit its 1.0 spec, after just 12 months of people knowing about it, we went around and polled the same exhibit hall. Already 25% of the e-learning vendors out there had adopted Tin Can, had put it into their products, had committed to doing new things with it. Tin Can's addressing a lot of big pent-up needs and demand in the e-learning industry and experiencing a very rapid adoption that is going to have profound effects on how this looks in a few years. So, quick refresher on what are some of these things that are enabled now by Tin Can that are getting people excited, that are allowing people to dive in and adopt it so quickly, and having fanboys and fangirls that come to many of these webinars to hear more and more about it. At its highest level, Tin Can is going to remove a lot of the constraints from SCORM that get us out of the box of simply delivering a course to a learner in a web browser that's a page turn and we track whether they finished and what their score was. It's going to remove those constraints and allow us to use a lot of new modern technologies for training in our training programs, things that we want to be able to do, but we just can't because it's just too hard or doesn't quite work in SCORM, are now suddenly possible. And when I talk about Tin Can in depth, if you go back to one of those webinars where I really talk about everything that happens, I like to use kind of a layers of the onion analogy to say, how is Tin Can interesting at its surface, and then dive down into deeper layers within there. So layer one of the Tin Can onion is the ability to use any training modality you want to. Like I said before, you're not stuck in a web browser in a page turner course with Tin Can anymore. All of a sudden now it becomes really easy to start using things we should have been able to do 5 years ago. If you want to put training on a mobile device, for instance, or if you want to use an educational game in your training programs, or want to deliver training in the moment of need and for performance support, or you want to use really high fidelity interactive simulation, or do things offline, or even track real world activities, all of these things were difficult, if not impossible, under SCORM, but they're all things that make for really, really effective training and learning environments. Tin Can's unlocking the ability to do these things. All of these types of things can now play well in our learning ecosystems. The next layer of the Tin Can onion is the fact that everything can become a learning event now. We're no longer limited to just tracking courses in a browser. We're no longer even limited to just tracking things that happen on a computer. With Tin Can, we can start to track any learning events, be they in person in the real world or be they informal, not prescribed. I could go track the fact that I watched a YouTube video or read an article or interacted with peers on my social network or was mentored by an expert or attended a class or attended a conference. All of these things are very, very valuable learning events that we can now start to incorporate into our learning ecosystems and monitor how learners are going through them and whether they're being effective. Excuse me. The third layer of the Tin Can onion is what I call free the data. And this is what we're going to really drill down and focus on in this webinar. What are the new possibilities enabled by Tin Can? Because in Tin Can, learning data can now flow across systems. In our historical SCORM world, it was about taking a course in an LMS and having that data live in that LMS, and there it just kind of sat there, and maybe your LMS gave you good reports to get that data out, maybe it didn't, but there's no way to get that data from one LMS to another LMS, or to share that data and look at that with a sophisticated analytics tool or reporting tool. That data was just kind of in that one system. We didn't have an interoperable way in the learning industry to transfer data across systems. Well, with the Tin Can API, now we do. All of a sudden, the Tin Can API allows for data to move across different servers. And that is what is going to have a lot of profound implications. Those are the implications we're going to be talking about today in the webinar. So that's a very kind of quick overview of why tin can is interesting. Now we're going to dive into what are some of these implications of being able to move data around. First, I want to start with talking about there's 5 key enablers, 5 new capabilities tin can introduces to enable these kind of new models of enterprise learning systems. The first technical capability is, as I just mentioned, the ability to transfer data between learning systems. Tin Can is implemented as what's called a RESTful API, which is essentially the kind of the modern way web systems exchange data. But Tin Can allows for not just the communication of an individual learner having done something, but the bulk transfer of records around between learning systems. The second key capability is the ability to capture learning data from any system. Tin Can allows us to track, yes, that we completed an online course, also then that we completed an educational game or that we did a learning experience on a mobile phone, but it allows us to capture learning data from other enterprise learning systems. For instance, an LMS on its own could be a provider of a big bulk chunk of learning data, or a classroom management system could be a provider of a chunk of learning, or even an HR system, and we'll talk a little bit more about these possibilities later on. But the point is, any system across the enterprise can now play in the e-learning world via Tin Can. Another key capability of Tin Can is that learning does not have to originate in an LMS anymore. Previously, to track something in the SCORM world, you had to go log into your LMS, go register for a course, launch the course, and take the course, and then all that data lived in there. Well, that's not necessarily the way we learn in the real world. Oftentimes, when we want to learn something, we go to Google or to YouTube or to any other types of systems, and we want to go there directly. We don't want to go in through this other dedicated system to get in there. With Tin Can now, we can start to incorporate all of those learning experiences into our ecosystem. Key point number 4 is the ability to correlate general activity with learning data. This is a really important point to start to understand. Tin Can is based on another specification out there called activity streams. And activity streams are a way of representing data that allows us to capture any type of activity. For instance, your Facebook wall is an activity stream, capturing your interactions with a social network. Well, Tin Can now allows us to then represent learning activity in that same format. That becomes really interesting when we start to think about how can we correlate actual job performance data with our learning data, and that's going to be another key capability that we're going to talk about in more depth later on. Another key capability is the ability to do specialized analytics. A lot of this system-to-system data transfer allows us to feed our data into systems that will allow us to look at it in new and interesting ways, to slice and dice it, provide interesting reports, interesting correlations. So those are the 5 kind of key capabilities that are driving our ability to rethink some of these learning systems. Now let's go in and look at a series of diagrams that talk about kind of the world as it is today and the way the world seems to be starting to move, catalyzed by Tin Can now. So take a look here at the diagram on the screen. The world today is, we have an LMS as a magical cloud of learning that learners enter into. This is kind of our corporate view of learning systems. We have an LMS and we have users, and the users go to the LMS, and that's what we have visibility into, that's what we track. But you take a step back for a moment and look at your own life. And I ask you, what percentage of what you've learned in your life did you learn from an e-learning course in an LMS, from a SCO, from a page turner, from what you're able to track and have visibility into in your LMS right now? What percentage of what you've learned has come from that environment in your life personally? It's an infinitesimally small percentage of what we've learned overall in our lives, but this is all we have visibility into in our current learning systems. In the real world, learners, yes, they're going into your LMS for a lot of formal and prescribed training, but they're also going to a myriad of other sources for actual learning events, be they blogs or articles or YouTube videos, or going to schools or seminars, conferences, going to their peers, reading books. This is how learning happens. This is the majority of how and where people learn. but we don't have any visibility into it. We don't track it. Learning often happens at the point of need, or when they want to learn, in many different contexts. And so, the question we start to ask then is, can we have a much better learning system if we're able to capture more? If we're able to capture more than the minuscule fraction that we're able to see right now, what new possibilities does that enable as we start to take a much broader look at a person's learning experience other than just their simple, formal, prescribed training? So that's one thing to start thinking about, is what should these learning systems look like to take a much broader view of our learning experiences. And let's dive into that box a little bit more and get into some of the ways our learning systems are now, and then what the immediate possibilities are for the future. So take a look at this box right here. This is a kind of simple drawing of what an LMS is today. And there's a lot of functionality in a typical LMS right now. They do many, many different things all related to learning. It probably has 50 functions in there. But how many of those functions are core to what the LMS does? How many of them are kind of the best of breed for what you're trying to do? And how many of those are just right for your organization? Taking a little bit broader look at what the current learning systems look like right now, we want to often connect our learning systems into business intelligence systems, into our HR systems, into our reporting systems. And we're seeing a big trend right now of learning management systems morphing into these other systems, whether it's the LMS vendor themselves, renaming and rebranding and adding new capabilities to make their system into a talent management system, where they're being subsumed often by larger enterprise systems being bought up left and right. This is all because learning is really just one piece of the large puzzle. Learning data in and of itself is only marginally interesting. Learning data becomes much more interesting when integrated with a broader context. And so how is TinCan affecting this part of the learning world? Well, if you go look at kind of the 80-20 rule for any system, which says 80% of the value of a system is delivered by 20% of the functionality. This is a common trend across many different types of systems, both in nature and in technology, all over the place. Well, if you look at the two core pieces of an LMS that provide most of the utility, I think most of it, and this will vary certainly based on the use case for the LMS, but in our experience and in the traditional corporate LMS, what we see as the two pieces of functionality that deliver most of the value are the ability to deliver content and the ability to track content. The ability to say, hey, go take this training, and then the ability to track who did what, when, and how did they do. These two things seem to be the core of why most people are using an LMS and what most of the usage is coming from. So we started to put a name on these. And in TinCan, we can now start to separate the two different components out into their own independent components. Remember, data can flow across different systems now. That allows us to start to decouple pieces of the LMS to be used independently. And so what we're seeing right now is the emergence of two new classes of software. We're seeing one called the LRS, the Learning Record Store, which is what does that tracking. And we're also seeing something we're calling a training delivery system, the thing that simply delivers and plays a lot of content. So now all of a sudden we can start to think about what does the world look like with the availability of independent learning record stores and independent training delivery systems, and how can we start to use these things in new ways now that they are technologically capable. We have a centralized component for allowing learning data to be collected from anywhere in the learning record store, and we have a different component to allow formal training to be accessed from anywhere in the training delivery system. These are two things that are starting to emerge, but I don't think we know exactly what they're going to look like yet. These concepts are just now starting to take hold and gather some momentum. But quite frankly, we're all in the process of figuring out what they might look like. In fact, there's a kind of a backstory to the creation of the Learning Record Store, in that it was almost created by accident. When we were creating the tin can specification a couple of years ago, we were geeking out in my office about what should we call the two things that communicate in the tin can API, and we didn't want to call it content anymore because as you know, tin can's about much more than just simple e-learning content. So we call those learning experiences. And then we didn't want to call it an LMS anymore because LMSs are renaming themselves and being subsumed into these larger HR systems. And it didn't have to be an LMS that was tracking tin can data. It could be an HR system or a talent management system or anything. And so we just kind of made up a new word for it. We call it the learning record store. And in our head, that learning record store was the part of the LRS of the LMS that tracks all of the tin can data, records all the results, implements the API. Well, as we start to present on the tin can API to the world, people start to really grab hold of this notion of the learning record store. And now there's a whole series of companies out there creating their own learning record stores and bringing them to market and putting additional functionality around them to make them a different class of learning tool that is out there. So how does the world look in this world? How do we see this stuff starting to emerge? Well, we're starting to see a world where all of the bubbles up on that prior slide that were inside the LMS can now be separated out, where we can start to have a learning record store as the central place for storing a lot of this data. And then those can have easy open connections via the open and accessible tin can API to a lot of the other systems. So the broken connections now to the reporting and the business intelligence tools can now all happen over an API that is open and standardized and just plug and play across different systems, but then start to look at, what are some of those other bubbles in there, and are there other tools that are a best of breed way to do this? And so, some LMSs start to have a social learning component. Well, is there a better social learning network for your company? What about a content management system? What about specialized reporting? What about search or specific industry regulation, management stuff? The point is now that since tin can is inherently open, and since data that goes into the LRS can be read by any other system through an open protocol, we can start to see a series of tools now that can all plug into the ecosystem and be very specialized or customized for different needs, for different niches, for different verticals. And this is really a new way of thinking about learning systems that is now suddenly technologically possible via the tin can API. Now, this is all very much in its infancy. There's still a lot of work to be done as this all starts to happen. There's plenty of other things, but the technology is pushing the industry in these types of directions, and that's going to change things. So now let's look at kind of some of these other kind of models of what the world looks like when using a learning record store as kind of a central repository of data coming in. And this is kind of the most basic representation of how that looks in a tin can world. You have a learning record store, and data can come into that. Data about learning experiences can come into that from a myriad of different sources. We have a course or just a regular web page or a game or a simulator. Any learning experience can now start to feed data into the learning record store. This is a pretty simple diagram to comprehend. Taking that to the next level, though, data can not only go into the learning record store, but remember, it can easily come out of the learning record store in an open way. And so where could it be sending that data to? It can send it to many places. One interesting one, in the traditional sense of a learning record store, it's part of an LMS. The data goes into an LMS, into the system of record for a company. Or it can go into many different LMSs. But more interestingly, why not send it to a reporting tool or a business intelligence tool or something along those lines? And an interesting example of this is we were talking to some people in the aviation community a few months ago. And they have all kinds of specialized data for a flight simulator, for instance, and they want to train their pilots in the simulator, then access it, and they want to have extensions to tin can to record how people are going through this simulator in a very verbose way that allows them to do some pretty deep analytics on it. And I was saying, well, tin can would be a great fit for you. You could do these extensions, and it's very extensible. You could do all this great stuff, but their response was, but that's all well and good, but it's not going to work for us. And it's not going to work for us because American Airlines or United or US Air, any of those airlines that they're trying to train the pilots at, they're going to have a generic corporate LMS that they're going to want all this stuff to go into. They're going to have a Saba or a SumTotal or a Cornerstone, and those companies aren't going to have our specialized report in there. But that's the beauty of Tin Can. Since that data can now come out from that LMS as well, Saba or SumTotal or Cornerstone, they don't need to know about the aviation-specific extensions. You can write your own report, your own analysis tool that gets that data out of that master system of record and start to look at it in new and interesting ways and do different stuff with it. That's changing things. That's a powerful new model. And so now all of a sudden we've got a bunch of data coming in from a bunch of different places, and then the ability for data to go out also to a bunch of different places. The Tin Can ecosystem is starting to get more complex. It's starting to allow for a more complicated flow of data around to different places, gathering it from all of the places where learning data originates, where learning actually happens, and putting it into places where it's much more useful than just being in isolation. So we've got the ecosystem over here, but now let's do something else. Let's go ahead and start to add another source of data coming in for job performance data and another source of data going out to a business intelligence tool. Remember a few minutes ago, we started talking about how Tin Can is based on activity stream, which is a format for representing any form of activity, anything that you are doing. And activity streams is being widely used across the social networking sites, Facebook, Google+, et cetera, et cetera. But also it's starting to be used across the enterprise to capture and report on what people are doing within enterprise systems. So now let's think about this a little bit. All of a sudden we can take the performance of how people are doing their job, tie that in with their training data, feed that out into our business intelligence tools. That allows us to now start to say, hey, is there any correlation between people who are training in certain ways and how well they're doing on their job? Conversely, is there a way to say, oh, these people aren't doing well on their job, let's reinforce that with training? We're now able to start taking a broader look at how training is affecting overall performance within an organization. And we're going to talk a little more about that even some more later. So let's do another quick poll question here. Do you work at an organization that has more than one LMS? You have about 30 seconds to let people respond to this. This is always an interesting one to see. As I go to conferences, I often hear many companies lamenting the fact that they have many LMSs throughout their organization. Each department seems to have their own, and that there's just no way to get them all to work together. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll right now. And this is actually pretty consistent with the last time we did this poll. About 35% of you guys work at organizations that have more than one LMS. And that's with about 150 people voting on that one. So it's a pretty common situation for a company to have more than one LMS within their organization, and each department has their own specific needs and wants, and one system isn't always good for all of the different use cases throughout a large organization. So an interesting bit of Tin Can now is, can you use a learning record store? Can you use this open flow of data between systems to try to consolidate the data from many learning management systems? Here's just one simple, a possible architecture diagram where you have a learning record store as the central hub for learning data within an organization. But each of your departments can go ahead and keep their own LMS. Each LMS can still serve the needs of that department, but all of that data can flow to one central place. So you still have a master record of how things are working within your organization, but the end users at the departmental level get all the functionality and gets to keep their little fiefdoms of learning systems that they need and they want. So how would this work in practice? Here's a diagram that kind of shows Tin Can being used to shuffle data between LMSs. And it's important to note there that, remember the original conception of a learning record store as the part of the LMS that tracks all this Tin Can data. We very much expect that all LMSs are going to implement their own learning record store internally. And so that's going to be the key. That's going to be what facilitates a lot of this data exchange. And in this model, we see either data flowing directly from one LMS to another LMS, or into kind of this independent learning record store as well. Learning activity goes into the LRS, potentially within the LMS, and then it flows out as needed. The LRS can either be used as that central storage place for learning data, or as the conduit to synchronize data amongst different LMSs. So here's a real-world example of an organization we're working with that's already doing this. They're taking the first few phases of this approach right now, and they're jumping into it, and we're excited to be working with them and to help make this a reality. Vanderbilt University Medical Center is that quintessential organization that has several LMSs that they're working with, but they want to adopt a tin can model where the LRS becomes the central repository that's able to take data from many of those LMSs, but also take data from many other systems out there, whether it be classroom events or medical simulations or informal learning activities. They need a place for all of that data to come in and to live. And furthermore, the interesting part about Vanderbilt that I love is they want to be tying this training data into their organizational pillar goals, into the things that the university management or the hospital management at least is trying to push. Higher levels of reduced disease through hand washing. They want to make sure that their training on making sure you wash your hands, as a simple example, is actually affecting, do people wash their hands, and are we able to notice a reduced rate of infections because of this? And so that starts to become really, really exciting, to take data from many, many different sources across a broad enterprise and start to roll all that up to a place where the C-level executives are going to make interesting insights from it. They're also keen on using a training delivery system as a centralized place to hold all of their existing formal content that allows each of those LMSs to access that content independently. That allows them to have one version of each of their SCORM courses that each of these LMSs can access. Content can be brought in once, tested in one place, get to function in one place, have all that master data live in the LRS, but be accessible from many of the different places. So we're excited to continue to work with Vanderbilt on this architecture. We're seeing many other organizations starting to move in this direction and adopt this type of view of the world. And it's been a whole lot of fun over the last few months, kind of watching these things emerge. So where else can we share data? Some ideas up here: talent management systems, compliance or regulatory tracking systems are big consumers of training data. But what about directly with the regulatory body? Now that tin can data can move across systems, there's nothing that says we need to keep that within our walls. That data can flow across enterprise boundaries, straight from my learning record store to my certification authority. What about sharing data now with past and future employers, rather? We can cross these organizations. What about with the learner? Now we're starting to change some things here all of a sudden. Note the periods and the question marks on this slide. There's some pretty straightforward ones to do, but okay, we're going to share data with other employers and with the learner. This is starting to change the model in new ways. Now the technology is now here to be able to do these things. Technology is now the easy part in a lot of these changes. There are massive bureaucratic, political, business model changes still to come, but the technology is there. Is that going to start to drive some change? And so a lot of this comes down to attitude. And so I want to take a couple more quick poll questions. So first of all, when a company provides training to an employee, should that company own all the information pertaining to the learner's completion of that training? Should that record of that completion belong to the company or the employer? Answer yes for company, no for to the individual. So wait just a minute here. It's a tough question. There's a lot of interesting nuance to who should own this information. Talk about that in a second. I'm going to close the poll now. And only about 28% of you think that the company should own the information. 72% of you think the individual should own the information. The last time we did this poll, it was about 43% thought the company should own it. So that's a slightly significant difference between the audience there. Now, I'm going to do a quick follow-on poll to that as well. In your opinion, do you think that your company would be willing to share non-confidential training data about departing employees if it also meant that it could receive the same data about incoming employees? Would your company be willing to share if it also was able to? Would it write to other systems if it could also read from other systems? And you can presume in this question that we're able to filter out things that are confident, that the employer considers trade secrets. All right, so that's been about 30 seconds, and voting seems to be slowing down. So in this case, 68% of you think that your company would be willing to share this information. And in the prior poll we did, we got about 56%. So again, a slightly more open audience that we're talking to here than the prior audience that did these polls to. And that's encouraging. That optimism means that these things are more possible than I had originally anticipated when I started doing a few of these polls. So let's take a look at what that kind of looks like. Tin Can enables another new paradigm that we're calling the personal data locker, where an individual has a system where they have their own personal learning record store, where they're able to store all of their learning information, and that learning information will come from a bunch of different places. It'll come from informal things they've done on their own. It can come from their school. It can come from several different employers, and then that person can choose to share whichever subsets of that data they want to with whatever person wants to read it. The change in the model here is the learner starts to own his or her data from many sources, and they're all stored in one place that the learner has access to. It's kind of akin to an electronic medical record in many as well. This is happening. This is ready. The technology is here for this. The question is, are we ready for it? And what you see up on the screen there is a screenshot from a very very simple personal data locker we threw together as kind of a proof of concept to show the possibilities around it. And so my contention here is that the technology for this is here, and that it is in fact a much better model. People should own their data, just like I own my resume. What I have learned is data about me. It's what I've done, and nobody's going to stop me if I want to go put my training courses on my resume, so why shouldn't I have electronic access to that data? I think sharing should be the norm. And I think for a rational organization, on balance, the value of the incoming data about incoming employees outweighs the cost of the sharing of that data. And so in a perfectly rational world, I think that everybody should embrace this model. Now, I certainly acknowledge that the world is not perfectly rational, and we have some hurdles to get there, but I think this is where we're going, and I think the technology is there for it now. And personally, as an employer, I know when I hire somebody that whatever I hire them for now, they're going to be doing something completely different in 3 years. I care so much more about a person's desire and ability to learn than I do about their experience on a resume. The most important thing I can ever hire for, and this is increasingly so in a knowledge-based economy, is a person's ability to learn. And so I think this is paramount for being able to get a good picture of who a person is, what they're all about, how they, in a demonstrated progress of learning and curiosity and increased understanding, provides such a valuable picture. I just can't imagine us not getting to a model where this becomes an inherent part of who I am that I take with me from many places over the next few years. That's an exciting paradigm shift, but it's also a very transformational one. That makes things very different in the world. And so these new models start to bring a lot of big questions up. How do you decide what training is proprietary to an organization? If Apple's coming out with the iPhone 7 or whatever it might be, and they want to train their salespeople before it's public on that, you don't want that salesperson to take the fact that they took that training somewhere else, because nobody in the world should know about the iPhone 7. Or how do you start to trust data from external systems? Tin Can enables something that allows you to validate who asserted a statement. So you can at least validate, if you see a statement that says Mike graduated from Harvard, you can at least say that Harvard said that, which is better than Mike saying that on his resume. But there's still a big question of how do we figure out how much we trust which different asserters things. What happens if we report failed outcomes onto a personal learner's transcript? Do they have the ability to remove those outcomes and only selectively show the things that make them look good? Lots of big questions, and I'm not going to claim that any of this is easy and straightforward, but this is the direction things are going, things are moving, things a lot of people are thinking about. So take a deep breath here for a second. That's a lot to have thrown at you guys over minutes. I want to take a step back and now go back to this this diagram about the sources of learning data. Consider that a little bit. We can track data from a lot of different learning sources now. And that causes us to now rethink what is a learning source. It allows us to take a much broader approach and take a much more comprehensive look. And learning happens everywhere, and now we can track it. But do we want to? And what are we going to do with it? How much data is too much? And what do we care about? What are the key learning events that are leading to significant outcomes? And then once we have that, can we prove actual causation, that a training event influenced an outcome positively, or can we just show correlation that the two things seem to happen together? We kind of need a whole new methodology for figuring a lot of this stuff out, and that's a lot of what we're working on right now, is a methodology for taking a comprehensive look at a training program and identifying the new ways that we can start to capture learning experiences, where these are going to come from. And the industry as a whole now almost needs a whole new set of thought models and best practices that allows you to get a whole lot more strategic about your learning programs. But it can almost be a foundational shift. We don't want to start in the box anymore. We don't want to start in the box of, I need to train people, so I'll go to a rapid authoring tool and create a simple page turn go, and I'll push that out through my LMS. It's time to take a step back and say, okay, I want to train these people. And not just start there, but say, why do I want to train these people? What's the business objective that I'm trying to meet? Okay, and then what is the best way to train these people? What systems and tools should I use? Then what do I want to track in there? And how do I then prove that I've met my business objective? And this is a new way of thinking. It really broadens the scope, and a lot of these things are starting to be enabled now. So, start to look at, where does learning really happen? It happens in a lot of places throughout your organization, with looking at an internet site, or accessing a help system, or your knowledge base, or interacting on internal social networks and forums, or any other performance support tools you have. If you think about your organization, I'm sure you can think of many, many more places where learning events are happening. And all of these kind of, what's the best word? I would call it a non-traditional learning tool, things where learning happens, but we don't consider them part of the learning ecosystem that we live in right now. All of these tangential tools can now start to weave into our learning ecosystem. All of a sudden, we're in a much broader world with a kind of a tighter net to be woven around there. And we're starting to see this with some of the early Tin Can adopters. A lot of the early Tin Can adopters are social learning tools or other things that aren't page turners. Not anything can be a learning tool. It doesn't have to be what we think of as a traditional e-learning authoring tool. It allows us to use whatever modality is the best fit for the instruction, and then just put the tracking in the back here. So some of the early Tin Can adopters that I've got up here that are in the learning ecosystem now, but really wouldn't have been able to play in it before. Curator it's an online platform that gives instructors the ability to kind of transform any digital content to a social game for learning. It's a really kind of social collaborative thing that brings in content from all over the web and turns into a learning kind of environment, if you will. Tapestry is a cool little mobile app. They've been on board with Tin Can from the very beginning. It's kind of a Foursquare for learning events. Check into a learning event on your phone. You can capture that you're at a conference section. PulseWeb is mostly an internal social network for an organization, but they're now using Tin Can to track learning events that are happening within there, including Yammer posts. It really started out as the social networking tool for an organization that is now working its way into the ecosystem. Brightwave is another one that's capturing informal learning events into the next generation LMS. Grassblade allows you to make statements from a WordPress site, from an internal site or whatever. We've got a Google Hangouts connector that's showing you, and you can record attendance at virtual meetings. And how easy would it be for GoToWebinar here to have a button that I can click that says record attendance, and it spits via Tin Can to any LMS that is out there that all you guys attended the session on Tin Can. All these things are kind of not traditionally learning tools, but now they're all starting to play in our learning ecosystem. Much more possibilities for how things can be used. One of my favorite examples out there is a company called Altair. They make engineering simulation kind of software. And what they've done is they've integrated Tin Can into their actual software. They're using, they're assessing, so they provide training on how to use their software, but then they're assessing a person's ability to do that in the process of using the software. So they're using the actual interaction with the software to say, does this person know how to use the software? And ladies and gentlemen, that's a heck of a lot more accurate than giving a multiple choice test. All of a sudden now your actual job performance is your assessment. And this is all coming in via Tin Can. With software, this is really easy to do. It's really easy for Altair to go ahead and say, yes, we can record how people are using the software and see if they're doing what they were trained to do. But really anything can start to make statements. And so much of our work now is being controlled by digital devices, especially when you consider the fact that we have a phone in our pocket that knows pretty much everything in the world that we're doing all the time. You can start to imagine lots of different things making statements about how we're performing our jobs, how we're doing the things that we're training for. We can assess our competency just in time, and we can deliver learning based on what was indicated by the actual job performance. So you can picture a GPS device in a car that reports on your driving speeds as a learning opportunity, or a point of sale system that reports on selling activity. There's all kinds of ways we can start to measure job performance and now correlate that with our training results in this ecosystem. And if we can do that, if we can have an actual kind of outcome analysis that ties our training effectiveness into the P&L, if we can show that improving our software usage cut down on tech support tickets, or that we're able to produce our engineering drawings 10% faster, all of a sudden now we have a very strategic role to be playing. Learning becomes a strategic function. It's a business driver that goes directly to the profit and loss statement. Broaden your horizons. Think about how what you're doing in the organization can affect overall performance, and now you can start to use Tin Can to measure that and demonstrate that. That is how heroes are made in organizations. That's how exciting things start to happen. So I encourage you when you're doing this to think about these things in feedback loops. Use the process of measuring improvement in performances to then go back and reiterate on how you want to deliver your training experience. Look for what's working. Iterate quickly. Use it as an opportunity for constant improvement. And there's when you start to do that, there's all kinds of new possibilities out there. So I want to give another quick example, one of my favorite examples of broadening horizons. And the University of Michigan Health System, another university hospital, coincidentally enough, they've been adopting Tin Can in a bunch of different ways. And my favorite quote from Ellen over there is, we're able to use it for use cases we have never been able to come close to trying before. So they're doing a lot of new things. So here's one simple example of just taking a step back and broadening the horizon using Tin Can to do a really effective training system. What they've done is they've put QR codes on a number of things around the hospital, and they essentially have a scavenger hunt as part of their new hire training, where the learner needs to go around, the new hire needs to go around and find all these QR codes on their scavenger hunt and scan them, and then they get their new hire training right there in front of the device. But later on, 6 months down the road, when they want to come back, if they see that QR code, they can scan it again and get that training right there again. And so what I really like about this example is it's using a simple existing technology, QR codes and mobile devices. There's nothing fancy going on there, but they're combining performance support, giving you the training you want just to need, with their new hire training, and it's kind of bleeding this intersection of the real world and the virtual world very effectively. You can get your training on the device when you're sitting right in front of you. You don't need to be sitting behind your computer in some training lab somewhere. You're actually looking at the thing as you're getting the training for how to use it. And then they can be tracking all of this stuff and who's doing what and how it's working out. So I'm going to kind of try to wrap up here pretty quickly so we get some of the questions. A lot of this leads to some big questions of how are we, how are we going to be responsible in this new world as we start to be able to track so many different types of events. There are plenty of privacy concerns to be dealing with. We don't want to be Big Brother. So there's lots of concerns about allowing people to know when they're going to be tracked. And kind of in an employer-employee context, there's a well-established precedent for tracking activity, but outside the corporation, it's a different story. So how are we going to deal with some of these privacy concerns? How are we going to decide who has permission to share what about people? So if we're in a model where my employer can share data with my personal data locker, can they also share it with another employer without my consent? What are the rules around that? Can somebody ask for my records without my consent? And how is that going to work? Some big questions around there. And the other big questions that we talked about before, what are these methodologies for designing these checklist for proving causation between learning events, deciding what to track? These are some big questions. So where does that leave the LMS in this world? And that's a big question that a lot of these LMS vendors are working on, that we're trying to work with a lot of our customers on right now, is what is the role of the LMS in a world where data is more freely moving, where things can be combined much more easily. And LMSs have kind of fundamental choices to make. Do they want to be the consumer of all statements? They want to be that centralized system of record that accepts data from everywhere. Or do they want to be a provider of statements? Do they want to be a specialized deliverer of training for a specific model and niche and then publish statements? We're kind of surprised to start that we're seeing different vendors adopt each of these models. Some are choosing to try to be the consumer of all statements, in which case they're trying to build out specific analytics tools to capture the new data that can come in via tin can. Others are taking the approach that they have a very specialized function and they're reporting stuff into a learning record store that can then handle all of the other sources of data that's coming out there about these informal events. And so it's an interesting dynamic going on in the industry right now. We're keen to watch that and to work with our customers to help them navigate that transition. The LMS certainly isn't dead. I think there's definitely a role for it out there, but I do think it will be different, and there will be a lot of new options that serve those capabilities coming out to the market soon. So we're really excited to be working on some projects with some really innovative organizations starting to put these things in place. And so that's kind of a very high level of where I think the LMS market's going, where the industry is going. A lot of interesting dynamics going on, a lot of new things made possible, a lot of innovation, a lot of room for new interesting things to happen. So that's about a wrap up for the presentation. I wanted to go over two last minute points. So we're going to take some questions right now, but we never have time for all the questions that we get. And generally we have a few people in the audience that want to go really deep on all these things. So if that's you, we're going to try something new right now. We're doing a special thing for people who came to this webinar. We're going to offer free one-on-one sessions with one of our Tin Can experts over here to explore how you could use Tin Can in your learning environment. And if you want to gather your team, we'll do your own little personalized session, an imagination session. It's not no hard sales pitches, anything along those lines. Really just diving down in deep to see how Tin Can is going to work in your organizations. What are some of the things you could do? How can you reimagine your learning environments? And so if you're interested in that, just simply respond to the poll question and we'll get somebody back in touch with you. I've committed to doing 6 of these personally myself, but we'll get somebody. We'll certainly get somebody in touch if you're interested in that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a few of the questions. Jeff and Andy should be feeding them over to me in the panel over here. It looks like we've got a bunch of them that have come in. I'll try and get to as many as I can in the next 5 minutes. And if we don't answer your questions here, we'll answer them asynchronously. If we don't, we always do that after all of our webinars. If you want more information, thinkcanapi.com. You can go look at all of our old webinars that we've done. They're all recorded, as will this one be. You'll get a link to that soon. Subscribe to the newsletter or the blog if you want to keep in touch with all that stuff. And when you close down the webinar, I think there's going to be a little survey that pops up to give us some suggestions for how we can make this better in the future and future topics that you might want to hear about. So with that, I'll take some of the questions that have come in, try to address some of those. They're not showing up for me, so I'll just grab a couple. So one here, how does a YouTube view get into the Learning Record Store? It's a good question. So a lot of these things requires either the experience provider, like YouTube, to make a statement, or it requires the learner to somehow capture that information. One of the great things about Tin Can is that Tin Can does not require the thing that asserts the result to be the actual learning content itself. And so the best way to explain that is to contrast that with SCORM, where in SCORM it was only the SCO, the actual training content itself, that could assert that somebody did something. In a Tin Can world, those two things can be different. The asserter of the thing can be different than the actual training content. So in a YouTube world, you could have a bookmarklet in your browser that you can click on that will show, that would allow you to record that you visited whatever page was in there, record your own learning event. So we can use that to record anything on the web as a learning activity, and not just those things being converted themselves. Another question, is there a standardized set of verbs that map to SCORM values? Yes, absolutely. ADL has publicized that, and that's public and out there. We can point you in the right direction to that. So we'll link in the post-webinar question answering. Where do learning objects, resources, reside in this case? The LMS or the TDS or learning object repository? Learning objects can reside anywhere. Learning objects could reside in any of those 3 places, an LMS, a TDS, or a learning object repository, or they could just be sitting out on the web on a link or on an internet site, or wherever you want them to is the real answer there. With Tin Can, we're not tied into that. You don't have to have a learning activity that's pre-registered in a LMS. You don't have to launch or in the LMS. You don't have to sign up or enroll. You can just go start learning and then start tracking those. It can really happen anywhere. All right, another question here. I got probably time for one more. Okay, the API is I did this. So if I finish, for example, an instructor-led class, don't I need some interface, an app on my phone to get this into my PDL or LRS? Yes, absolutely. When I mentioned there's a wide opportunity for innovation and new tools coming out there, a lot of those are for how do we get this information in there. I gave you the example of Tapestry. It's kind of a Foursquare for learning type event earlier, where you can check into a conference or a class, or we can have this GoToMeeting session record things. You've got your bookmarklet that could record things, and there's a bunch of other examples for ways of doing this. But yes, absolutely, you do need some type of interface for recording all of this information. I expect to see a whole lot of that start to emerge over the next few years, and a lot of interesting tools. But my overall thesis on that is our lives are increasingly pervaded and controlled by digital devices that know what we're doing at any given time, and those can all start to be making statements and capturing a lot of this information. So there's both an automatic way that things can be monitored and recorded, and manual ways they can be recorded. So with that, we're about out of time, coming up on the top of the hour here. I want to thank you guys for coming out and listening to me talk to myself for an hour over here. Like I said, we'll get to all of your questions post-webinar. And be sure to stay in touch. Sign up for the newsletter, the blog. We've got more of this stuff coming out here. And send your questions over. If you have individual questions or want to go in depth on this stuff, we've got people here, they spend their whole days just talking about Tin Can. It's all we do. It's what we love. We're happy to do it with you at any time. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out, and we're always here, whether you're a customer of ours or not. We love to just see this stuff go. So anyway, thank you for coming out, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.